Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for this virtual talk, Food for the Body and Soul, Goizueta Gardens Evolve in a Global Pandemic. Please add your questions to the Q&A tab at any time this evening, and I will share them with our speakers later in the conversation. I am very excited to be here this evening with my colleague, Sarah Roberts, Olga C. de Goizueta, Vice President, and Emily Roberts, Director of Urban Agriculture for the Atlanta History Center. Although they share the same last name, please know they are not related. Sarah and Emily, you both have unique, fascinating backgrounds that led you to your work here at the Atlanta History Center. Would you both share a bit about yourselves with our audience? And we can start with Sarah.
Sure. I have been here for nearly 10 years now. I grew up gardening and went to Berry College to get my horticulture degree. But it was an internship at the Arnold Arboretum up at Harvard University where I realized I really wanted to work in the public garden side of the green industry. So when you're in a public garden setting, you get to work in these huge and beautiful historic landscapes. You get to preserve biological diversity or work on collections and advancing the mission of an institution through the lens of horticulture and nature. And that's what really appealed to me. So I carried on my studies at the University of Reading in England and stayed there for a year studying historic garden design and soil science. Had no idea how useful that would be later in my career, as we'll find out more later. Then I went on to the New York Botanical Garden, and I was their curator of herbaceous plants and outdoor gardens for 5 years. I moved back to England and did a postgraduate diploma in garden design, and then moved back home to Georgia.
Wow, that's super impressive. Emily, your background is also completely fascinating to me. Please share a bit about yourself.
Thank you. I am from Southern Indiana, a very small village called Owensburg. Shout out to my Hoosiers that are out there on the call. I can't see you. I got my degree in international studies from Indiana University with a focus in human rights and social movements. And I started my career working in policy and advocacy in Washington, D.C., and the whole time was volunteering for an organization called the Washington Youth Garden, which is a 1-acre fruit and vegetable garden on the grounds of the National Arboretum. And that was something that allowed for me to sort of center myself. I grew up gardening with my dad and putting up the food from our garden with my mom. And it's very central to who I am. And so that made me realize that that was something closer to what I wanted to be doing with my career. So I worked for the Washington Youth Garden for a year, moved back to Indiana to be closer to my family, became an elementary school teacher, did that for 4 years, 2 in Indiana, 2 here in Atlanta, and then found this job. And it was something that was connecting my interest in being outside, in growing food, and being connected with the earth, and also in educating people and talking to people. And then all of a sudden, an opportunity also to use my knowledge of human rights and the history of social movements. And so it's a perfect job for me.
Well, as you both know, you're 2 of my just very special colleagues here, and we have a lot of kinship among us. But before we dive into the conversation this evening, as the Cherokee Garden Library Director, I would certainly be remiss if I didn't ask each of you to share something special you learned by exploring the resources of the Cherokee Garden Library at the Atlanta History Center.
Who would you like to start off?
Let's start with Emily.
Okay. Well, I work on a historic farm. I'll tell you more about it in a little bit, but part of my job is making sure that the practices that I'm using are consistent with the mid-19th century farming practices. And I know for current farming practices that in order to keep the weeds at bay, which is a constant battle for any farmer, but so for me, is mulching. And so we have a lot of leaf litter mulch, and I was going to use it, and then I thought maybe I can't. So I went looking for primary source materials to justify the use of leaf litter mulch. And so I poured through these agricultural newsletters called the Southern Cultivator that we have in our collections and in our archives, and I found it. I found an article that was recommending going out into the woods, collecting the dead leaves off of the forest floor, bringing them into your garden, and that being something that could help grow your plants and that you wanted to grow and keep the weeds at bay. And it was great. And so yeah, I went looking for receipts to use leaf litter mulch, and I found it in Cherokee Garden Library.
Fantastic. That's what garden library directors like to hear. Sarah, what about you?
I have had a lot of opportunity to work in the Cherokee Garden Library and use those amazing resources. I remember when I started here, how excited I was to find out how extensive the collections were. And also that I got to work with STACI, CATRON, who is a font of knowledge. So utilize that at every chance that I get. And one time that we had a lot of fun was working together on putting together the Bartram Exhibit. And William Bartram was a naturalist, and he traveled through Georgia in the 1770s and found all these amazing plants and documented them. And so we were researching his work and what he saw. And then STACI had the artists put the botanical illustrations up and curated that amazing exhibit. And my part was to bring that outside. And so from those botanical illustrations, I was able to select which species that we had growing out in the Corey garden and get permission to print those images and put them in front of the plants themselves so that our visitors could compare the artwork with the actual living specimen. And choosing those was hard because there's a lot of overlap. So when I was reading through that, doing the research, I came across this story that has stuck with me all this time, that he was sleeping in the woods and he woke up at dawn with this cacophony of sound, and it was wild turkeys calling to each other from the tops of tops of Taxodium disticum. Yeah. He had a different name for it back then, and that's another thing we used the library to research, was the changing names over time to figure out what plant he was talking about today. So anyway, I always think about that and how different that was to today, to the experiences you would have camping in nature now, and also in how we think about turkeys. We don't think of them so much as wild birds as part of our ecosystem like they once were. And so now later on, being fascinated with turkeys, we ended up getting them at the farm as well.
Yay, go Tallulah. The Atlanta History Center Goizueta Gardens are remarkable 33-acre green space, and it holds 9 distinct ecologically beneficial and educational gardens. Tonight, we're going to focus our conversation on 2 components here, the entrance gardens and Smith Farm. Both places that feed your soul, your mind, and local communities that are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Sarah, we're going to start with you this evening. To me, the new entrance gardens are just completely incredible. Every time I'm on campus, I take time to go be in them because they're healing and wonderful, and I learn a lot just by being in the space. And these gardens are inspired by the new perennial movement in garden design. Will you share a little bit of the background on this garden design movement and why you chose it for the entrance gardens here at the Atlanta History Center?
Sure. So on your first point, the new perennial movement is something of a misnomer. It's not really new. It's been around since probably the 1920s in Germany and the Netherlands. And like many movements in the arts, it was a reaction against what was in vogue at the time, which was tightly restricted formal gardens and the ubiquitous herbaceous border. In this case, that meant bringing some of the native plants into the mix, which was revolutionary at the time and exciting because all of us plantsmen and garden designers like to use new species in our work. So this evolved into what became known as the Dutch wave. So another name for the same thing. And that's when designers Piet Eldolf, the German plant breeder Karl Forster, the Dutch landscape architect Mien Roos, all were creating these huge public and private gardens that were very inspiring. And that and later in turn inspired Wolfgang Omi and James Van Sweden, who are American designers. And they began their work over here and then gave it another name, the New American Style. So all of these steps along the way of this movement led to what we have now, which is really, I still call it the New Perennial Movement, as a simple way to just capture all of these steps, but it's gardening in harmony with nature. It's creating something of an idealized landscape that still evokes the emotion of being out in these wild spaces, and do something for your soul when you walk through those gardens. And so that was really the inspiration behind this style here, to get to your second part of your question. I also looked at the land available to work with. It's right here behind me, in one small section. But what we had was lots of long, linear, but narrow planting beds available, which I put together in a certain way. But then what I needed was a planting style that would allow it to flow from one bed to the next throughout this whole landscape and unify all these disparate elements. And also at the same time, soften all of the angles of the architecture, which is very modern, and it suits the styles marry up well, and it softens all of those angles and corners that are part of the architecture. So trying to reconnect people to nature was a driving force behind this idea. And one thing we talk about a lot is plant blindness. And that is that when people in the modern era, we leave our homes, we get in our cars, we drive to work or the shops, we get back in our cars, we drive home. We live this very interior life. And so I wanted to create an ocean of landscape. So when you drive here and you park on the parking deck, you walk through this landscape, which should be very wide open and inspiring and naturalistic and interesting all year. And then you enter into the next phase, going into the museum. So that was a big part of it. And then also to evoke that emotional response in the visitor, just like you were standing out in a big meadow, to bring back that kind of feeling.
Well, I think it's been extremely successful, and I know people enjoy it very much when they come. Before we talk plants, Sarah, let's talk earth. As all gardeners know, everyone on this call that's a gardener, and the three of us, if you don't have good soil, you won't have healthy plants. Tell me about the soil conditions you faced here in front of the museum building, and what had to be done to make it sustainable for plants and their pollinators.
Yes, this site was a challenge. All of its separate pieces were a challenge. They were all once under construction. And construction means bringing in heavy machinery and driving over the soil or scraping it off. So that intense soil compaction then crushes out every little pocket of air and water in the soil, and you're left with this clay brick of land to work with, and it's impenetrable to water or plant roots. So you can't work with it. How do you create healthy soil? It's a difficult process. In nature, it takes millennia to build topsoil, but we were trying to condense that time frame down to just a couple of years. And so what we opted to do was a historic method of from farming, which is cover cropping. Healthy soil is full of life. A common phrase is that 1 teaspoon of topsoil will have 1 billion bacteria, and that doesn't even cover the fungi, the nematodes, the protozoa, earthworms, and all of the activities that all of those different creatures carry on underground. And that's what makes plant life possible. So I wanted to get that out there. Rejuvenating the soil does not come from chemistry. It requires a biological approach. So in front of Brausch Coffee, right here, behind me, and the Texas Locomotive right there, and the cyclorama is where we did the most intense amount of work. We had a lot of fun out there, didn't we, Emily? Emily had a huge hand in the success of this garden by prepping the soil.
A huge amount of sweat.
Yes, all of the things. So what we did was we chose about 18 different species, that one group in spring and one for fall. We grow those crops on. Cover crops are plant species that are grown specifically for the benefit they bring the soil. So rather than something that you would harvest for human use. So some plants like rye put down very long, thin roots, and they're hunting out nutrients and bringing them back up to the surface. Other plants like tillage radishes look like big fat carrots, and they just pound their way down through the hard pan and crack that open. And in summer, we put in our biggest, leafiest crops, which would reach 7 or 8 feet, and then cut them down at the end of their peak season of growth and till them under, force feeding the soil with all of this organic biomass. And that in turn rots down, and that organic matter is what is feeding your whole soil food web. That's the foundation of life in the soil. So microorganisms then break down all that organic matter, and that is what releases the nutrients for uptake by plants. And as those roots break down, they are leaving little channels behind, and that gives a head start to the next plant to root into the soil and create pathways for microorganisms and water to flow through the soil. So we did that for 2 years. I think it was very successful, and it's interesting now when we had to dig down to put in a staircase, and you could see the horizon layers in the soil, all this organic matter and the incredible work that went into it, and then the solid orange clay underneath, where we didn't go any deeper. But so far so good. Matching the plant needs to the soil type that you have is the key to success, and that's what we're doing up front.
Fantastic. I mean, I'm just so glad you explained that to our audiences, because I think wherever you live in Metro Atlanta, you're going to encounter impacted clay, hard soil to deal with, and we'll get into more specifics maybe during the Q&A. Sarah can give some advice on specific plants for you to amend your soil and make a more happy environment for your plants. The Goizueta Gardens team, who are all amazing, and 2 of them are on this call this evening, used over 15,000 native and non-native species of plants for the entrance gardens. So just to get our minds around that for a moment, 15,000 species. I read about plant species all the time because I'm always fascinated about new plants that are being discovered and brought back and propagated. So there, as you both know, hundreds of thousands of plant species in the world, and more are being documented every single day. How did you and your team decide on those 15,000 selections?
And that is the fun part, and also just such a challenging part. There's almost too many options. So there are a few themes that come together, I think, when you put together any exhibit, and I think of all of our gardens as curated outdoor exhibits. One of the themes that rose to the surface for me here was using Georgia native plants, and not exclusively, but as the dominant percentage. And here it's actually 85% of the plants out here are native to Georgia. So by doing that, I could focus more clearly on species that we don't see enough of. There are certain plant groups that are like asters, for example, where there's certain cultivars that are very popular and you find them at all the garden nurseries. But what you won't find is our endemic Georgia aster, Symphytrichum georgianum. And so we had to source that plant and get it here, and I knew like that's going to be one of our absolutely most important plants. We want to be able to demonstrate to all of our visitors that the flora that we have here is every bit as beautiful as Asian flora and all these other species, and well adapted to our climate and our soil conditions if you marry it up to the right piece of your landscape. So really looking through which performers we already have in the Corey Garden or in Swan Woods, the rest of our native, or the farm, the rest of our native plant collections, and thinking like which one of those could we bring right up to the front. This is like the front porch. It just wraps all the way around the Atlanta History Center, and what plant species can I bring right up to the front to really show people and hopefully see those plants become a bigger part of the nursery trade down the road if we create that demand by people going and saying, hey, I want this plant that I saw at the Atlanta History Center, Goizueta Gardens, where can I find it? And encouraging nurseries to carry these native species. So there's quite a few in there that have proven to be excellent performers, and we can talk more about those in the Q&A. But so that was one big piece, was pulling in the Georgia native species. Within that was selecting plants that support pollinators. So as we said earlier, this style of gardening, it's like working in symbiosis with nature. It's trying to make this work with nature rather than fight against it. So also with pollinators, you can plant generalist plants like catmint or calamint and it will pull in all of the honeybees all year, the whole time they're not in winter. So we'll see those in droves, but honeybees are not native to Georgia. So we also need to plant species that attract the native pollinators and support our local ecosystem. And this is where works from Doug Tallamy at the Cherokee Garden Library would be excellent resources for you to check out and read. So a lot of the plants that we chose, like the baptisias, are ones that support native pollinators. There's quite a few within here. A third grouping are those plants that I think will be the most adaptable to climate change. So we know that this is coming. We know we've selected plants that generally can take our climate, that can take our soil conditions, and can they adapt to one year having hardly any rain and brutal heat, and another year having torrential downpours. And this is just our normal now, the flood or famine and our swings of temperature. So some plants put down very deep roots, and they are slow to grow those first couple of years, but in the long run, they will stay throughout all of the challenges that are thrown at them. Baptisias, panicums, these are a couple of those species. So those got merged into the selections. And then the fourth is really the nitty gritty of the design element. I was looking for plants that hit very specific design needs to get the kind of feeling that I wanted to have in this garden. There are soft, romantic gardens as a whole. And so you put in big sweeps of grasses that have feathery or airy seed heads. And then in front of that, you would put a plant that has a very long lasting, but structurally interesting seed head. So think of a cone flower in front of a cloud of panic grass. So that's just one example, but there's iterations of that throughout this landscape. So flowers that have spikes, those that have a ball form, and then plants that create like an airy, hazy cloud, and then contrasting all of those forms with each other. And within that, you're looking for plants that have stems that will stay upright through winter, because this style of garden is not a neat and tidy garden all year. We have to break our own habits of trying to be super neat and tidy and cut everything down as soon as it's done blooming. This garden is about leaving the plant stems up, leaving the grasses up. They stay up. That prevents erosion, the rain from hitting the ground and washing off all that topsoil you work so hard to have. And it also leaves the seed heads for birds, and it leaves habitat for all the critters that are going to live out there that are beneficial to your landscape. But how do you do that in a way that instead of looking messy, looks beautiful? So you're looking for plants that die well. It's a very strange concept when you first have to wrap your head around it. But things like, again, cone flowers, they hold those stems really sturdy, and that cone lasts like a little black orb in the landscape for a long time. And then that cloud of grasses behind it can just stand up all winter, and it creates a very interesting winter landscape. It's a different look. It's a different aesthetic, especially for Buckhead and Atlanta and the area that we're around. So in order to make this more palatable, I guess, and I think it also just helps generally, all of these sweeps of perennials and grasses are backed by clipped evergreen hedges or deciduous. And we'll see those throughout the landscape. That's a common repeating design element as you go from one end of campus to the other, whether it's a clipped hornbeam hedge, or we have holly hedges that have a little bit of a wave design to them behind the perennials in the front. Those help bring some cohesiveness and structure to the garden, especially in the winter when it's a series of beiges and greens and browns.
Well, it's absolutely incredible, and I hope everyone listening will come to the History Center at different times of year and really explore this. And it's beautiful to study the plants and the design and see all the pollinators. It really is special. To me, of course, because I'm a complete plant geek, I can remember early on when I met Sarah, we both had these pins on our jackets that said plant geek. Do you remember that?
I think I had one that said, if you were a plant, I might remember your name.
Oh, yeah, you did. And I think mine just said plant geek. But so to me, in the entrance gardens, the plants and the pollinators are really the wow factor. And I just love it and could just study it and be there all day. But the site also has another very impressive feature, the new tree table. And I wanted you to tell us a little bit about this unique addition to the entrance gardens and how it's being used right now during the pandemic.
Tree table was a very big adventurous project. And I think if I'd started and known how much work it was, I would have given it some pause, but it was totally worth it. It took about 3 years all in. We had a dying white oak on campus, and we had pruned it every year, and it was getting smaller and smaller in its canopy. And I decided in the long run, it was about 100 feet tall, that I didn't want to lose it. We figured 140 years old. I wanted to do something cool with it and honor the life of this old tree that had been on our campus for so long. So in the end, what I decided to do was, see if this works, if you cut the tree vertically from branch tip to root flare and then laid it down horizontal to keep the structure of the tree, but lay it all the way down and make it into a giant communal table. And that's what we did. So the process was taking it down in 8 to 10 foot logs, sealing the ends so it wouldn't dry too fast, planing it into 2 and 3 inch slabs, and air drying it for 2 years under cover. When it got to 14% soil moisture, then it was ready for the wood to be worked. So I hired Kirk McAlpin, a local woodworker and expert in his craft, and he began working with me to inventory and measure every single slab of wood. We got all those dimensions, and then I started piecing together the design of how these slabs would line up with each other to recreate the form of that tree. And then once we had that nailed down, I made templates of all of them, and we laid those templates out in the field. And actually this is under the trees that are right next to West Paces Ferry. There are existing pines and oaks in that area, and I didn't want the tree table it's 60 feet long, and I didn't want it to bang into any other trees. So we used the templates to be able to dodge and branch the table around the existing trees on the site. So it's very much custom built for that one location. And he was working on the incredibly intense work that it was to get them sanded and planed and flipped over and over to get every corner smooth, and then put a marine grade epoxy and varnish finish on that so it will last for a very long time. Meanwhile, I was working on the table bases, the structures that would hold up each of the 15 individual tables that make up the collective tree table as a whole. And ended up, because the site it was sitting on is undulating, the ground isn't flat, we decided to do a couple of things with that. I didn't want to put holes in the ground for concrete footings to hold up each table. So I ended up with a sled design. So it holds the table up, goes down, and then lays on the ground out of weathering steel. And then we put all of those together, but to get it to lay flat, the gardens team, who are amazing problem solvers, got out there and raked off the mulch. We surveyed it, put down some geotextile, and then filled all of the low spots with gravel. Put another layer of geotextile fabric over the top and a thin layer of wood chips over that. So you never know the engineering that's underground underneath the tree table. But the air pockets and all that gravel are what allow air and water to run through that space so it doesn't smother the tree roots that are underneath it. The last thing we wanted to do was hurt the trees by putting up this table. So then we installed the table, and then COVID happened. And so we couldn't open it, which was really, really hard. But then we got through to the point where we could open Goizueta Gardens, and the table is cleaned every single day. And you are welcome to come out here and have a socially distanced picnic at any branch along the table. It has been busy out there since the day we took the covers off. It is so gratifying after all that hard work. It's really beautiful, and I wish I had another picture I could show you here, but I hope that you'll come out and see it.
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing every time you talk, it's just your knowledge is so vast and wonderful, and just love hearing you explain things about the gardens here and your passion. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Someone else on our team here who's also very passionate, incredibly knowledgeable, is Emily Roberts. Emily, you manage the landscape of Smith Farm here at the Atlanta History Center. Some people joining us this evening are very familiar with Smith Farm, but others aren't. Will you describe components of Smith Farm and the gardens you work in most often?
Sure. So Smith Farm was originally built 4 miles away from where we have it now, and the original house and kitchen that were behind it were built in the 1840s and were moved here in the late 1960s, early 1970s to recreate on a postage stamp postage stamp what a working slaveholding farm of the Atlanta area in the antebellum period looked like. So in addition to the house and the kitchen behind it, there is a collection of other historic buildings from central Georgia farms of the mid-19th century. And then the landscape also represents the era. So there are gardens. Basically, the farm is the gardens are the farm. It's a farm, right? So, so there's the swept yard that's by the house that's planted with heirloom flowers. All around the farm, including around all of the farm's outbuildings, are naturalistic native plantings like Sarah was talking about before. And then we have the family favorite of the heritage breed: sheep, goats, chickens, and turkeys. Everybody loves them, including me, and they live on the farm. And the three areas where vegetables are grown is where I spend the majority of my time. Not all of my time, but the majority of it. And that is the kitchen garden, the enslaved people's garden, and the field. And in those areas, I grow most of the same vegetables and herbs that a home gardener today would put in their vegetable garden. They're just varieties that were around in the 1860s or beforehand that might be slightly different than what you're planting in your garden today.
In the past, food was grown at the farm for educational purposes, a tool for educating the public about heirloom vegetables, especially school children, lots of school children in the past, the people who grew the vegetables, and foodways of the 19th century. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 this past March, you have pivoted to grow crops for production. What led you to this change?
Yeah. So yeah, I would say I do still grow for educational purposes. And what I grow is still these heirloom or pre-heirloom varieties of things. And the landscape is still a tool for interpretation. That's really how I see it, is that my job doesn't exist if we're not talking about this history. That's my whole job, is to sort of like create this immersive experience, right? And our historic interpreters use the gardens to talk more easily and more comprehensively about the condition of enslavement in our area. And yeah, like you said, how some foods got here, Southern foodways, and about resistance in the face of forced labor. Yeah, so your question, right, is about like making this change.
Right, when the pandemic started, you have your hands full. It's a hugely demanding job, by the way, for anyone listening, what Sarah and Emily both do, because I see what they do every day, and it's very demanding and a lot of work. So when the pandemic hit, I just, what in your mindset just pivoted and made you want to expand the use of that site?
Sure. Yeah, so it's March was the beginning of my growing season. I'd already made my crop plan. I had my spring vegetables started in the greenhouse. I was on the road for, like the past seasons. And even though the Atlanta History Center did close to the public, Mother Nature didn't quarantine, right? And so we were coming in on a staggered schedule, and without the interpretive staff here and not really knowing, it was a very uncertain time. We didn't know what was going to be happening, right? I was just trying to think about, it was very uncertain, and I was very uncertain, and it was scary. It's still scary. And so I was trying to think about what can I do? Like, what can I control, first of all, so that I just don't freak out, and how can I contribute? I think just to for anyone who doesn't know me, I think a good thing for you to know about me is I graduated from this high school that really emphasized citizenship, and we defined citizenship as being a responsible and contributing member of your community with a sense of humor. And that really resonated with me as a teenager, still does. And partially that's because that's the family culture that I was raised in my little village too. And so that that definition has kind of been my guiding light in life, and it was my guiding light in March as well. I have this incredible resource at my fingertips. I have an extremely supportive and smart boss, and I had a relationship with the executive director at Concrete Jungle, the organization that we partner with. And I have at the time I had a lot of time and energy, and I just thought, let's focus on getting food to people. And food is a very like visceral kind of gift that we can give to our neighbors, right? So anyway, I went with it. And it wasn't a huge change in my plans. I had to make a few changes to my crop plan, including omitting the non-edible things that I grow for educational purposes, including things like cotton and sorghum that we make into corn, or that we make into broom corn. But my day-to-day has been pretty different. A lot more intensive harvesting. And then I have also added, everything from washing, weighing, individually packaging, and then delivering the food to the distribution site that they have, that they run out of the Pittsburgh neighborhood in Southwest Atlanta.
Food insecurity in our city and our country is worsening every day, and we're all aware of that. The organization Feeding America states that 1 in 9 people struggle with hunger in the United States currently. And I've read that many times in the last few months, and every time I read it, it takes my breath. Locally, organizations, including Concrete Jungle, with whom we're partnering, are working with communities experiencing food insecurity. Tell us a little bit more about the partnership with Concrete Jungle and how many households have been reached through this effort.
Yeah. So I already knew CATRON, and we had already been talking about how this year maybe I would be able to contribute some of the excess that we had from the farm and get it into the hands of Concrete Jungle for, however, if they wanted to pass it on to their food pantry partners. They were doing cooking demonstrations for people, so maybe they would use it in that. But then in March, Concrete Jungle announced that their food pantry partners were running out of food. Grocery store shelves were going empty with people, the threat of quarantine. And so, more and more people were coming to the food pantries, and there was less and less food. So Concrete Jungle pivoted to start a new grocery delivery program, full service groceries, to fill in the emerging gaps. And so I texted CATRON and I said, hey, I don't have very much. You know this, you've been here. I'm not a production farm. I don't, and I'm growing these old time vegetables that don't produce as much as, market grade vegetables today. But I have a little bit and I would like to contribute it. Can you use it? And she said, yes, please. Absolutely. So that was March 29th that I texted her. And my first delivery to that depot in Pittsburgh was on March 31st. And since then, I have donated over 1,000 pounds of food to Concrete Jungle. From mid-June until just this past Saturday, that was weekly on Saturday mornings. And that distribution center that I deliver to weekly serves about 50 households a week. But I think the other thing that I just wanted that your question kind of was making me think about is why does this exist in the first place? Like, why do we have to have these food distribution centers, and what is the need? And I am not an expert at all on food insecurity, but I've been learning a lot about it, and Concrete Jungle has been so helpful, and CATRON in particular has just been so helpful in sort of helping me understand so that I can better communicate about it, and so that we can consider, making these connections, past, present connections. And so I just wanted to offer just what I mean, like the definition of food insecurity, and that's a lack of consistent access to adequate and culturally appropriate food resulting from lack of money or resources throughout the year. And you're right that statistic from Feeding America was 1 in 9 people in the United States NPR just released a whole hour-long segment about food insecurity on their coronavirus podcast just within the last week. I think it was this past weekend. And new studies have shown that it's 1 in 6 people, not 1 in 9. It's 1 in 6 since COVID. And these are our neighbors. No matter where you are, where you're watching from, who's your family, I'm talking to you too. No matter where you're watching from, these are our neighbors. And it is kids, that's the other thing. And so this is a problem. And and this is more locally. This is pre-COVID again. 755,000 Atlantans and North Georgians turn to food pantries and meal service programs every year. So that's over 80,000 people a week, and this is pre-COVID. And people are having to choose between food and other basic needs like housing, utilities, transportation, medical care. And when people experience this for a long time, it's associated with things like, they're not achieving as much academically, they're not getting adequate intake of key nutrients, and an increased risk of chronic disease, which can put people at higher risk for COVID-19. So it's just a compounding problem.
Food insecurity disproportionately affects Black community members in Atlanta. This issue, as you've noted and what you just spoke about, is compounded by the disparate economic and health outcomes of COVID-19 in our community right now. Some in our audience know about and are aware of the food justice movement, and others aren't. You've given us a bit more knowledge about this movement, but maybe talk about it more broadly in terms of our city, and share what community involvement for any of us would be in Atlanta if we want to be a part of being really in the community with all our neighbors.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I'm not an expert. I think that this is an important thing that I want to just keep emphasizing, and I'm learning as I go. And I'm just trying to keep this guiding light that I was talking about being a responsible and contributing member of my community with a sense of humor. Not necessarily a good one, just a sense of humor. But ultimately, this is about equity and dignity for everyone in our community, right? And we have to change the status quo. And I want to be clear that this isn't just about doing things for people, but about changing these systems that are hurting people. And you're right, disproportionately hurting people who are Black and brown. And you don't have to be an academic or a historian to see that there are undeniable trends that our under-resourced communities are always hit hardest. And this is not new. This is not a new racial phenomenon, right? And we have to acknowledge the social and the economic roots of the problem and the historic neglect that has resulted in these staggering statistics. The History Center in June said, however difficult the past may be, we must face it to understand our present and plan a better future. Our past cannot be fully understood without examining the history of racism and institutionalized discrimination in the United States. So we have to acknowledge this can't be separated from acknowledging the disproportionate impacts across race, right? We know that health inequalities are what has led to a disproportionate number of Black people being hospitalized by COVID-19 in the United States, in Georgia, in Atlanta. And devastating job losses, the economic impact is also disproportionately affecting people. These job losses hit Black workers and their families especially hard, with Black women facing the largest losses. And Black workers are more likely to be in those essential worker jobs that are forcing them to risk their health and their family's health. So then, so then what? And I guess what I would love for people to walk away with is just an encouragement to do something, find what works for you. Again, consider not just doing things for people, but consider changing the systems that are hurting people, and do that, contribute, and do that responsibly, responsible contributing member of your community. So educate yourself so that you can be responsible, but there are so many, you could read all the books, you could read all the magazine articles, you could listen to all the podcasts. And if you don't take action before you've read and listened to it all, you'll be dead before you do anything. There's too much to read. So read, learn as you go, but you also need to contribute and find what's right for you. Figure out what you have to offer. For me, again, I have these resources, I have this very supportive boss. So growing food and talking to people about what I'm learning when I'm learning it, this is what's right for me. For other people, it might be volunteering your time. It might be advocating for stronger safety net services for people like SNAP and WIC. It might be buying products from Black businesses and donating to Black-led organizations and mutual aid projects. It's really easy to find them in Atlanta. We're filled with them. And that's the number one thing that Black leaders are asking for is volunteer time with us, give us, your resources, buy our products, put your money into, Black-led businesses and organizations. And have a sense of humor. Be flexible, be humble, be willing to unlearn as much as you are learning.
You always just inspire me beyond words, Emily, but you know that because we talk off webinar all the time. One final question before we get into our Q&A, because I think it's about 7:45, and of course I could talk to you all night, but we do know people have the rest of their evenings as well. You grow and harvest food at Smith Farm, a representation of a working slaveholding farm from the Atlanta era in 1860s. And I think this is a good question to end on. Why do you think a history center like ours should be involved in addressing and contextualizing the problems you've been talking about tonight?
I think it's a really great question that we have to ask ourselves over and over again. And we do have a new interpretive plan that we have internally to help us kind of grapple with these questions. And in it, we have foundational truths off of which we base our work, including in the gardens. And since we've been, working with this, I look back at these. I really like these kind of structural documents that help me understand who we are and who we're trying to be, right? So there are a couple that really resonate with me and with the program that I'm trying to do, the partnership that I'm trying to build with Concrete Jungle. So one is factual information about the past coupled with interpretations of that history provide tools for critical thinking and civic engagement. Civic, citizenship, responsible contributing member of your community with a sense of humor, right? Exploring the past is a critical tool for understanding the present and planning for the future, right? Atlanta provides a lens through which we can understand regional, national, and global issues. 100% true in this situation. History is analysis and is not just the sum record of human events. We provide thoughtful and informed analysis and offer visitors the opportunity to do the same. So if these are our truths, these are not all of them, these are a few of them that I think, really hit home for me. If these are the truths, then of course we're going to look at the data about food insecurity and disproportionate impacts along racial lines, and we're going to see the need to provide a space for exploring why. Why is this the way that things are? You can come to the History Center and you can learn about historic events that have kept certain people marginalized throughout history, from enslavement to the Black codes to Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, but also at the same time, you're going to learn about creativity, resistance, and resilience in these communities in spite of it. And for me, that's confirming that we should seek and trust Black leadership. That quote that I read to you earlier from the History Center, that was after George Floyd was killed in Minnesota this summer. So again, however difficult the past is, we must face it to understand our present and plan for a better future. Our past cannot be fully understood without examining the history of racism and institutionalized discrimination in the United States. And at the same time, we're not just passively documenting history, right? We want your contributions for the COVID Collective, but we're not just I'm not just sitting around like waiting for people to give me things for that, right? We're all a part of history making right now. And so what's history going to say about us and about me and about how we're responding to these realities of the pandemic and its impact on our neighbors?
So perfectly said, Emily. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible knowledge and your passion and for being an advocate. We have just about 10 to 15 minutes left. Boy, that went by so quick. I don't even know where the time went. So let me get into the Q&A box, and there's going to be a range of questions. So I'm just going to throw them out. Some will be for Sarah and some will be for Emily. Since this is a question we have, since we are talking about gardening, I have 2 acres of land. If you're going to grow mangoes on the campus there, where would you start and where do I start?
Mangoes.
Mangoes. I've
I
never
would
grown
start
mangoes.
in the conservatory because they're not hardy here.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I've never even considered growing mangoes in Georgia.
That would be amazing, but
That would be
I
amazing.
bet we will in another 100 years.
So another plant question. Sarah, do you have a list of cover crops you use throughout the 2 years that we could share?
I do, and I'll have to figure out where I can post that. But yes, we do have that mix that we used here, and certainly some of those species were better than others, but I can certainly share that whole list.
Okay, well, maybe on this program site after, on the History Center's website, we can put a few links to documentation.
Sure.
I can say that we got the mixes from So True Seed, which is a North Carolina-based seed company, and they have cover crop mixes. So we use the summer one and the winter one that they have.
So another question that we often get, or I often get this too, why not plant 100% Georgia native plants?
Great question. And there's a couple of reasons why. Some of this style of garden is also about style. And so if I am looking for plants that create interest throughout every season of the year, then I may need to pull in some species that are either very long blooming, like the calamint that I mentioned before, which blooms for about 6 months and feeds pollinators that whole time. It's a generalist plant species, so many different types of bees, wasps, flies, all pollinate that plant, and they don't. Being a generalist, the mouth parts of those insects can feed on it, unless you're a specialist insect and you need a very specialist flower to pollinate. And we worked to have both. So we have plants for long tongue and short tongue bees, and then we have plants that bumbles, carpenters, honeybees, and everything else can pollinate. But also some species of plants like Agastache Blue Fortune is one that is just a really strong performer, and it flowers and flowers and flowers throughout the year and is covered in pollinators, but it's also not native. So that's one that provides the nectar and pollen that we're looking for as part of our goals, but also provides a very long season of interest aesthetically to contribute to that goal of the garden as well. So sometimes you're pulling in species that do a different job, and some of them are workhorses, and most of the species that we have out here that are not native are very strong pollinator plants. And I'll point out too that honeybees are not native, and we do want to feed them as well. So it's good to have some of these species that keep them fed all year.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I have a question for Emily. Do you all need volunteers to help with the harvesting, weighing, washing, and packaging of the food that goes to Concrete Jungle?
Yeah, in an ideal world where it was possible for us to work really close to each other, I need your help so badly. I have been very COVID careful. I feel strongly about doing that while our numbers are still where they are. But that's not always going to be the case. It's not always going to be the case that it's going to be like this. So yes, please come and volunteer with me, with anyone on our gardens team. You can do that by going to our website. There is a volunteer orientation to go through with our fantastic volunteer coordinator, Jamie. And so if you go, I don't remember exactly how to navigate it in the website, but our website is fantastic and it'll be easy to figure out. It's get involved or explore something. Volunteer, sign up, go through the orientation, tell her you're interested in gardening, tell her you're interested in working with me in particular, and she'll connect us. And as soon as it is safe to do so, I will gladly take your help.
Thanks so much. A super fun question, Emily. Actually, this is a friend of mine who asked, where did you go to high school?
I went to a very small school. This is not my entire high school, but for the last 2 years of high school, the one that I graduated from, a very small school in Bloomington, Indiana called Harmony School. So fantastic pre-K through high school, and I graduated with 17 other people.
Fantastic. I think a lot of people are going to be Googling that school. I have another kind of extensive question here. So she's sharing some knowledge. FYI, Thomas Jefferson planted native plants in his garden at Monticello to impress foreign visitors. Love to hear about you attracting native pollinators. Are you trying to provide some education for visitors about other needs for these pollinators? Host plants for caterpillars, bare soil for solitary ground nesting bees, nesting hollows for solitary bees, etc.
Boy, I love these questions.
Yeah,
Such a great one, and imparting a lot of wisdom there, all good things. There's a lot of that we're doing. Part of that is in the management of the garden, so I'll address that first. When I mentioned that we're not going to be neat and tidy gardeners and cut everything back, that is leaving those hollow stems for bees to hibernate in winter, because they will. The solitary bees will go down inside the stems of certain plants. I think Veronicastrum is one of them that we have out there. And so you don't cut it back. You could leave 18 to 24 inches of that if part of it goes over, and leave that up all winter. The leaving bare ground, one of the sad things that we've heard about a lot lately is the loss of fireflies. And that's another insect that needs bare ground in order to survive, or leaf litter. And so we have a big expansive area around the tree table and in many other parts of our campus where there's earth and leaf litter and wood chip mulch that is left as part of the habitat. But also the entrance gardens is one of the 9 signature gardens here. And this is a 33-acre campus. And we have vast, extensive collections, particularly native plant collections, across the rest of our acreage. And so when you go to the museum and you go out the back door, you'll start entering into the rest of the landscape where you'll find all of those things. To the point about interpretation, that is a huge goal for us, is to have more interpretive panels out in the gardens. Right now, what we're doing is putting plant labels out there. So little 3x5 plant labels where you will find information about basically why was that plant chosen for this landscape. So if it talks about sustainability or pollinators, those were themes that we covered in the entrance gardens. You'll find that information on those plant labels. In other areas, like in the Corey Garden or Swan Woods, which are all Georgia native plants, those areas we talk about Creek and Muskogee and Cherokee culture. And so you'll find how did they utilize certain plants, what plants were used for spiritual purposes, utility, food, medicine, also how early pioneers learned some of these techniques, how they applied them, how those plants served medicinal purposes during the Civil War. This is when you go to STACI CATRON in the Cherokee Garden Library and you say, I need to borrow Francis Porche's tome, Resources on the Southern Fields and Forests, and look up all this research about how plants were used when there was no access to Western medicine during the Civil War. And then you pull out all that information and you put it on a sign panel. So we're looking forward to doing that. That is a big goal for this year. And there's a lot more of that to come. But in the meantime, you want to look out for Goizueta Gardens staff members and our guest experience associates, and look for people around the gardens to tell you about all the different things there are to learn when you're on campus. And soon we'll be also looking to a new website. We'll have a lot more information on our website.
I have a few more. Are y'all game to go 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Everybody will hang in there. These are great questions, so I'm going to share them. Do you educate about introducing herbs and native plants used for purposes other than food, as medicinals, dyes, for pest control, etc.? Not referring to commodity crops like cotton or tobacco.
At the farm, do you want to do that one, Emily?
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. The landscape was used in a number of different ways, and gardens and cultivating gardens was used in a number of different ways. And so in particular in the enslaved people's garden, we have, I grow a wider variety of medicinal herbs, for instance, to talk about how, you know, folks were not only growing their own food, they were not given access to doctors, so they were growing their own medicine as well, and about what some of those plants were, how they might have been used, and about the style of gardening, which is consistent with indigenous cultures using companion planting. So growing, you know, plants close together that are not competing with each other and may in fact even be helping each other out. So definitely using the landscape to talk about more than just food.
Okay, looks like I have two more. This woman's writing to say she's a newcomer to both gardening and to the state of Georgia, and she wants to know, are native Georgia plants mostly ornamentals or edibles? I never thought about that. She's very interested in just curating a more native plant garden in her own little container gardens.
I love that. I love that. That's
know.
a great goal. I think of these plants as existing in their own right. They were here before people and how people deciding how to use those plants. And so they are just part of our ecosystem. And then how they get utilized by us, that's just up to us. So if you find it ornamental, it's all in the eye of the beholder, right? One of my favorite Georgia natives is Scutellaria, and there's several species, but it has blue flowers in summer and beautiful leaves, and you can cut it back and it'll flower again. So it's a great ornamental. It's not one that I've ever used in garden design outside of in this style. And why not? It certainly could be. It's just not one that we have looked at and thought of as an ornamental, but it certainly is. And so are many of our native grasses and caryxes and all these other wonderful plants. So for container gardening, you have a little bit of you're creating an artificial environment for those plants to grow in. But that's where I would say, you know, look to your local nurseries and ask for some local advice. But there's a lot to choose from, and maybe one option that you could look at is coming here to look at things that appeal to you ornamentally, or down in the Corey Garden or Swan Woods. Some of these species need really deep root runs and don't work well in containers, and others would do absolutely fine. They just require a lot of watering in Georgia in the summer if you're doing container gardening. And then of course there's a lot of herbs and medicine plants that can grow in containers just fine.
So final question, and you both can speak to this for our evening conversation. In addition to choosing hardy plant species, what else are you doing for climate change planning, resiliency, and education at the Goizueta Gardens? Big question.
Such a big question. And the first thing that comes to mind, because it happens so frequently, is how we manage stormwater. It's not a real exciting topic to talk about, but it is a fact of life now. We get 4.5 inches of rain, which should be 4 weeks worth of rain, and we get it all in 4 hours. So a lot of the work that we've done here has been in stormwater mitigation to capture that first inch of rainfall on our campus, channel it into garden areas, so and then making those areas adaptable to seasonal flooding plants. We've done this at the farm. We've done this in multiple places across our campus and out in Swan Woods. So building in stormwater capture mechanisms, even our waterfall in the Corey was built as a way of capturing stormwater, and each bowl that the water falls into holds it for a minute, slows it down. So as it goes downstream later, it's not scouring the stream banks and flooding the gardens or rushing out of our property. It is being slowed down on campus. So that's, as we look at climate change and we're looking at more extreme weather, that is something that we have to address, is our water, both when we get too much of it all at once and when we have none at all. So we're also always trying to look at smart ways of watering our gardens. And a recent adaptation to that was installing a computerized irrigation system with soil moisture sensors. And that tells us the moisture level of our soil, and when it is too high, it will ensure that the irrigation doesn't run. So you're not watering in the rain, or you're not watering when the soil is already saturated. So finding other ways like that to reduce water, and then also using plant selections like we did in the entrance garden, plant selections that can tolerate some drought. They can tolerate a little bit of too much water, but they can tolerate some drought as well. So being smart with your plant selections and not putting in something like delphiniums that are just hard to grow and they don't really want to be here and you're going to have to water them all the time. It's just not worth it. Learn what grows well for you and grow lots of it. And hopefully it's native.
Can we get a t-shirt with that? Emily, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, we compost. That's a big thing that is a huge part of my job too. So we have Super Jenny and Brash Coffee on our campus, as well as the Swan Coach House. We collect their scraps from their kitchen. So not the stuff that's gone to consumers, but pre-consumer food waste and coffee waste from them. And we have a hot composting system with our farm animal debris. So we're diverting all of that from the landfill, and then we're creating this incredible money can't buy it resource that we're putting back into our gardens.
Well, I think we're about 8:05, so I want to thank Emily and Sarah for sharing their expertise, their passion, and their hearts with us this evening. Appreciate it so much. To everyone out there, we invite you to keep coming back or come for the first time to see our Goizueta Gardens and also to explore the many resources of the Cherokee Garden Library. Both of these gems are right here on the campus of the Atlanta History Center, and you can learn a lot more about all the topics we covered tonight. Thank you for joining us this evening. Stay safe.